I was recently looking through some footage from a tech hub in Shenzhen, and I saw something that, at first glance, looked like a total victory for labor rights. On December 4th, the workers at Yilishing Technology were told they were finally getting what the international community has been demanding for years, a strict 5 days, 8 hours schedule. No more grueling overtime, no more mandatory late nights. On paper, it was a dream of modern dignity. But as the announcement went out, the mood didn't lift. It shattered. Instead of cheers, there was a heavy, panicked silence. I saw reports of workers staring at their phones, frantically running numbers on calculator apps, their faces turning pale. They weren't celebrating their newfound free time. They were realizing they could no longer afford the rent. By the next morning, the factory gates were blocked. But this wasn't your typical strike for shorter hours. It was a mass of hundreds of people effectively demanding the right to be overworked again. It is a jarring, almost surreal contradiction. A legal work week that functions exactly like a predatory pay cut. To the company, this was compliance. To the workers, it felt like a soft layoff, a calculated strategy to make life so unaffordable that they would be forced to resign voluntarily, allowing the firm to dodge millions in severance pay. That instantaneous shift from the promise of a balanced life to the reality of a sub-survival wage leaves you with a deeply uncomfortable question. When following the law is used as a weapon to pressure the poor, where does the blame actually lie? Is this a case of a company playing a cynical shell game, or is it the sign of a governance system where the minimum wage is merely decorative? To understand what's really happening in Shenzhen, we have to look past the legal hours and into the logic of survival.
And that is it's the devastating paradox at the center of everything we're looking at today.
It really is.
And to really grasp the gravity of what you just described at Yilishing Technology, we have to zoom out a bit. We have to look at the entire economic engine of the Pearl River Delta.
Right. This isn't just one factory.
Not at all. What we are witnessing isn't just a single labor dispute. It is the friction point of a massive tectonic shift in how the world's second largest economy functions.
A tectonic shift.
Yeah. We're looking at a collision between a high-tech national strategy, what they call Made in China 2025, and the low-wage reality of the people actually tightening the screws on the factory floor.
And that is exactly our mission for this deep dive. We are going to investigate this specific economic paradox. Why is it that compliance with labor laws can actually, threaten a worker's survival?
It's a question that turns our whole understanding of labor rights on its head.
It does. And we are going to act as your guides through a stack of pretty intense source material today. We've got reports on that Yilishing dispute. We have data on the infamous 996 work culture from Rockbird Media.
We also have some deep analysis on industrial automation and robotics from Premia Partners, which is fascinating.
And some heavy-hitting academic papers from the Mosbacher Institute on something they call government capacity.
Yeah, and we also have the Shenzhen Sustainable Development SDG report, which gives us the government's official roadmap. And what we are going to see, I think, is that the core tension here is between the aspiration for this high-tech, automated future.
The shiny robots and all that.
Exactly. And the messy human reality of the workforce that built the present, the people who are still living in that old model.
Okay, so let's unpack this. We need to start with the economics of what I'm calling quiet desperation. We mentioned the Yilishing technology dispute in the opening.
Right.
The workers were blocking the gates because their hours were cut to the legal standard. To an outsider, specifically someone perhaps in a Western office job, asking to work more hours, asking for overtime sounds baffling. Why isn't the base salary enough?
That's the billion-dollar question. And it comes down to the math of the wage standard versus the take-home reality.
Right, the paper versus the pocket.
Precisely. If you look at the source material regarding Shenzhen, specifically the figures cited in the analysis of that dispute, the headline minimum wage is approximately 2,520 RMB per month.
Okay, so that's the official number.
That's the official number. I think that went into effect around March 2025.
Yeah.
And for part-time work, the hourly standard is roughly 23.7 RMB per hour.
Let's pause on that figure for a second. 2,520 RMB. Depending on exchange rates, we're talking about roughly $350, maybe a bit more. There's a very small amount of money for a city as expensive as Shenzhen. I mean, this isn't a rural village. This is a tier 1 metropolis with skyscrapers and, really high cost of living.
It's one of the most expensive cities in China. And that's the key thing to remember, that 2,520 is the gross figure. That's the number before the government takes its slice.
Ah, before deductions.
Exactly. The sources highlight that workers reported once you take out the mandatory deductions, things like social insurance, housing funds, If you are working a strict standard week without any overtime, the take-home pay drops to under 2,000 RMB per month.
Under 2,000? Wow, that's staggering. If I'm a worker in Shenzhen, how far does 2,000 RMB actually get me?
Well, let's do the math. It doesn't get you very far at all. A single room in a shared apartment in one of the manufacturing districts, and we're not talking a nice apartment, we're talking a bed in a room, they can easily run you 800 to 1,200 RMB.
So half your take-home pay is gone just on rent.
At least. Then you have food. Even if you're eating as cheaply as possible at street stalls or the factory canteens, you're going to be spending 30 to 50 RMB a day.
Okay, so that's another, 900 to 1,500 a month?
Right. So do the math. If rent is 1,000 and food is, say, 1,200, you are already in the red. You haven't paid for your phone, your transport to get to work, you haven't bought soap. And most importantly, you haven't sent a single yuan back to your family in your home village, which is often the entire reason you're there in the first place.
That's sub-survival money. You literally cannot exist in the city on that wage.
It is sub-survival for many. And this is where we get to the concept of the hidden subsidy. This is a crucial economic idea to understand this whole region.
A hidden subsidy.
Yeah. For decades, the manufacturing model in the Pearl River Delta hasn't actually been based on the minimum wage. It has been based on the minimum wage, plus heavy overtime.
So the overtime isn't a bonus?
It was never a bonus in this system. It was the structural pillar making life affordable. The workers budget everything, their rent, their food, the money they send back home, based on the assumption that they will be working 60, sometimes 70 hours a week.
So the entire lifestyle is built on the assumption of exhaustion. That's a grim thought.
It's grim, but it's the reality. Precisely. The base wage is the floor, but the overtime is the walls and the roof.
Yeah.
And if you take away the overtime,
the whole house collapses.
the house collapses. So when Yilishing Technology announces 5 days, 8 hours, they aren't giving workers a break. They are effectively kicking out that pillar.
They are. And the workers, they get this instantly. They perceive this new policy not as a benefit, but as what did the source call it? A soft layoff.
A soft layoff. And the source material from Jason B., which analyzes the layers of responsibility here, points out that this is a calculated strategy. Think about it from the company's perspective.
Okay.
If the company officially fires you because they don't have enough orders or because they're automating the factory, they owe you severance. It's based on your years of service. That's the law.
And if you have 1,000 workers who have been there for 5 or 10 years, that bill could be massive.
So it could be millions of RMB in total. It's a huge liability on their books. But if they just make the wages so low that you can't possibly pay your rent, what do?
You quit. You have no choice.
You quit. You resign voluntarily. And if you resign, the company owes you nothing. Zero.
That is incredibly cynical. So you're using the letter of the law. We are compliant with the 8-hour workday to completely circumvent the spirit of labor protection.
It's weaponized compliance.
Weaponized compliance. Wow.
And the workers see right through it. I mean, they aren't stupid. They know exactly what game is being played here. The reports detail that the company tried to smooth it over. They offered a one-time allowance.
Oh, how much?
200 to 300 RMB for employees who didn't work overtime in December.
200 or 300 RMB? That's what, $40? That's barely a couple of days' food.
The workers view that as an insult. It was completely inadequate. And that is why they bought the factory gates. They weren't fighting for the right to be exhausted. They were fighting against a loophole that was going to starve them out. They were fighting for the economic viability of their lives.
It really reframes how we think about the 996 work culture. You know, we usually talk about 996, 9 a.m. to 9 p.m., 6 days a week, as this oppressive thing imposed from the top down by tyrannical bosses in the tech sector.
And it is. For white-collar workers, it often is.
But for the blue-collar worker, it seems like a necessary evil they've become completely dependent on.
It's a dependency. It's a financial addiction, you could say, and it's widespread. Despite the official caps, the labor law technically caps the work week at 44 hours. The data from Rockbird Media shows that as of mid-2025, the average Chinese employee still works 48.5 hours weekly.
And that's the average.
That's the average.
Yeah.
That includes government workers and office staff who might be leaving on time.
So the reality on the factory floor is much, much higher.
Much higher. In these fast-growing sectors like e-commerce and electronics, longer hours just remain normalized. There is internal performance pressure, sure, but for the factory floor, it is purely about that overtime multiplier. Weekends are paid double, holidays are paid triple. Workers will literally fight for those shifts.
So we have a workforce that needs overtime to survive and a company that suddenly wants to cut it to normal hours. But why now? Why is Yulishing, and presumably other companies, suddenly so eager to enforce strict hours? Is it just to avoid severance? Or is there a bigger industrial shift happening? Because if business was booming, surely they'd want the workers on the line.
That's the key question. And it is definitely the latter. This dispute is a symptom of a massive structural pivot. If business were booming in the traditional sense, making millions of cheap plastic widgets, they would need the bodies on the line. But we are seeing the end of the world's factory model.
The cheap labor, high volume model.
That model is dying. And what we're seeing is the painful birth of something else. And this brings us to the rise of automation and the concept of Industry 4.0.
This is where it gets really interesting, because we have a story that illustrates this transition perfectly. I was browsing through some local forums and social media feeds from the Pearl River Delta recently, and I came across the story of a man we'll call Old Chem. He's a veteran of the Shenzhen assembly lines, the kind of worker who for 15 years measured his life in overtime hours. To him, a good month meant having no Sundays off, because that's how he sent money back to his village to support his kids' education.
That's the classic story.
It is. And I saw a post describing the moment his factory transitioned to a high-value automated model. And initially, you can imagine there was a lot of fear. When the company slashed overtime, the workers felt like their entire lifeline was being cut.
Just like at Yulishing.
Exactly the same panic. But try to imagine the shift. Instead of standing for 12 hours doing these repetitive manual tasks, Old Chen was put into a state-sponsored retraining program to operate the new robotic arms.
So he wasn't laid off, he was retrained.
He was retrained. And I heard that for the first time in a decade, his paycheck stayed stable despite working fewer hours.
Yeah.
Because his labor was now categorized as technical supervision.
So his value went up.
His value per hour went way up. And reading this, I felt a sense of cautious optimism. While the no OT policy initially looks like a pay cut, it's actually the painful but necessary birth of a model where a human's value isn't just their stamina, but their ability to manage the machines that do the heavy lifting.
It's a structural pivot from being the world's workbench to becoming his engine room.
That's a great way to put it.
That story of Old Chen it's the ideal scenario. That is what the government wants to happen. That is the poster child for this whole transition.
Right, but how common is that?
Well, that's the question. But to really appreciate how significant Old Chen's transition is, you have to look at the sheer scale of the machinery that is replacing his old job. The data on Industry 4.0 from Rockbird and Premia Partners it's absolutely staggering.
Yeah, I don't know.
China is the largest market for industrial robots in the world. In 2024 alone, they installed approximately 295,000 new units.
Wait, let me double check that number. Nearly 300,000 robots in one single year.
Yes. And get this, that accounts for 54% of all global installations.
54%.
Let that sink in. More than half the robots installed on the entire planet went into Chinese factories in 1 year. This isn't a gradual implementation. This is a flood.
That is an absolute explosion of hardware. It sounds like an industrial revolution compressed into just a few quarters.
And demand has doubled over the past decade. We are seeing this specifically in automotive, 3C electronics. That's, computers, communications, consumer electronics, solar, and medical.
All high-precision industries.
Exactly. They don't just need speed. They need exact, flawless repetition that a human, no matter how skilled, struggles to maintain for 12 hours straight. A robot arm doesn't get tired at 10 p.m. It doesn't need a smoke break.
And most importantly for the company, it doesn't need overtime pay.
That's the bottom line. It explains why the demand for human hours is dropping so precipitously. If you have a robot arm doing the welding or the micro soldering, you don't need 3 guys working 12-hour shifts. You need one Old Chen monitoring the robot.
Right. And this all seems to be part of a bigger plan.
It is. This aligns perfectly with the national strategy known as Made in China 2025. The goal is to move the country away from being a producer of cheap, low-tech goods, the toys and textiles of the past.
They want to move up the value chain.
Way up. They want to indigenize technologies like AI, 5G, and robotics. They want to shift from low-end assembly to high-value-added processes. The labor dispute at Yulishing is what happens when that shift is messy. The company wants the high-value efficiency. They want the robots and the clean balance sheets. But the workers are still stuck in the low-wage structure where they need 70 hours a week to eat.
So the technology has upgraded, but the compensation model for the human beings hasn't caught up.
The software hasn't caught up to the hardware, if you will. The economic software of wages and livelihood is lagging way behind the industrial hardware of robots and automation.
It's not just a choice by the companies, though, is it? I mean, it's not just that they prefer robots. I was reading in the Rockbird Media report that there is a demographic pressure cooker underneath all of this. It's not just robots are cool or robots are cheaper. It's we might run out of people.
That is the other half of the equation, the human equation. Automation isn't just an option anymore. For China, it is becoming mandatory because the workers are disappearing.
Disappearing how?
China's working age population, which they define as ages 16 to 59, fell to about 864 million by the end of 2023. That's 61.3% of the total population.
864 million is still a lot of people, but the trend line is what matters.
It is pointing sharply down. The total population has declined for 3 consecutive years. The demographic dividend, that endless supply of cheap young labor from the countryside that fueled the economic miracle of the 90s and 2000s, is gone. It is over.
And the next generation is different.
Completely different. The new generation is smaller, they're better educated, and they're far less willing to stand on an assembly line for 12 hours a day doing mind-numbing work. They've seen other options.
So labor scarcity is pushing firms to use robots. They literally can't find 5,000 people to stand on a line for minimum wage anymore, so they buy 500 robots instead.
Correct. The entire economic model is pivoting from man-hours to throughput. How much can we produce, regardless of how many people it takes? And interestingly, this is fueling the rise of domestic automation giants.
So they're building the robots themselves.
They are. We see companies like Shenzhen in events and Zhejiang Sukon challenging the big international players like ABB and Kuke. They are building the machines that are replacing the manual labor. It's a completely self-reinforcing cycle.
So for the old Chens of the world, this is a sink or swim moment. The sheer number of available workers is shrinking, so the remaining ones have to adapt to work with the machines. But what about the workers who fall through the cracks? The ones who don't get the retraining, the ones who are just told, no more overtime, good luck with rent.
That is where the state comes in. In a pure market economy, those workers might just be left destitute. They would be the casualties of progress. But China operates on what's called a developmental state model, meaning the government actively manages these transitions to ensure social stability. They can't afford mass unemployment or social unrest. It's their biggest fear.
Which leads us to our next story. I recently watched a documentary clip about a young labor mediator in the Longhua district, and it reminded me of the immense pressure on state capacity to keep up with all this industrial growth. There's a story I found online about a young woman named Lily who moved to Shenzhen with that tech life dream, but ended up in a dispute when her base salary couldn't cover her rent after her factory eliminated extra shifts.
The exact Yilisheng scenario.
The exact same one. However, her narrative took a really interesting turn. Instead of a standard crackdown on the protest or just a cold dismissal, the local labor bureau stepped in. They enforced a new quality growth wage standard, specifically for high-tech manufacturing zones.
So the government intervened directly.
And I heard that the government didn't just tell the company to pay more, they provided tax incentives that were linked directly to sustainable livelihood metrics for the workers.
So they made it financially attractive for the company to do the right thing.
They did. Imagine the relief Lily felt when she realized the state was moving from being a passive regulator to an active architect of her stability. My takeaway from her story is that the Shenzhen miracle is entering a second phase. It's no longer just about how fast we can build, but how well we can protect the builders.
I think that's right.
And while some might see that kind of government intervention as a burden on the free market, in this context, it feels like the necessary invisible hand ensuring that industrial success actually translates into a dignified life for the person on the floor.
Lily's story is a perfect example of what that Mosbacher Institute white paper calls government capacity.
Right, that term you mentioned earlier.
Yeah. Their research argues that the single most significant factor in improving labor compliance isn't pressure from big Western brands like Nike or Apple, and it isn't even NGOs. It is the capacity of the local government, their ability to legislate, to audit, and most importantly, to enforce.
That's a key distinction because we often hear about corporate social responsibility or consumer boycotts, improving conditions. You know, we buy fair trade coffee or clothes and think we're saving the world.
Right.
But this research says the heavy lifting has to be done by the state.
It does. Because voluntary compliance by companies only goes so far. There is always what they call a gap between labor law, what is written on paper, and labor practice, what actually happens in the factory. High government capacity shrinks this gap. The state is the central actor with the authority to enforce its own laws.
And Shenzhen is special in this regard.
It is. In Shenzhen, this is particularly relevant because Shenzhen is a demonstration zone.
I saw that in the Shenzhen SDG report. It's officially designated as a National Sustainable Development Agenda demonstration zone. That sounds like a lot of bureaucratic jargon, but what does it actually mean for the average person like Lily?
It means Shenzhen has a specific mandate to experiment and to lead. They are the laboratory for the rest of China. The report details policy shifts that go back decades to the 90s, where they were explicitly kicking out low-end, polluting, labor-intensive industries.
So they've been curating their economy for a long time.
A very long time. They are adopting what they call a two-systems approach. Innovative service support plus talent diversity. And they're also focusing on healthy Shenzhen, trying to reduce personal medical spending and increase public health funding.
Okay, so connecting back to Lily, the state is trying to build a safety net. If housing is cheaper or medical care is covered or social governance is stronger, maybe she doesn't need that 996 survival wage as desperately.
That's the theory.
If the government covers the basics, the wage doesn't have to be quite as high for her to survive.
That's the theory. They are trying to reduce the need for overtime by increasing the social wage, the benefits you get just by living there.
Yeah.
But as we saw with the Yilishin case, the transition is rocky. You can't just build a safety net overnight while simultaneously pulling the rug of overtime payout from under people.
The timing is everything.
The timing is everything. If the rug is pulled before the net is built, people fall hard.
It seems like the companies have a huge role to play here, too. I mean, they can't just wait for the government to fix everything. We touched on the idea of the high road versus the low road in HR policies.
This is critical. The low road is the sweatshop model we've been talking about.
Yeah.
Low pay, high turnover, treating workers as disposable parts. This model works when labor is cheap and plentiful.
Which it isn't anymore.
Which it isn't anymore. The high road involves modern HR strategies. Better pay, training, retention. The Mosbacher paper suggests that these high road factories actually perform better and, crucially, attract reputation-conscious buyers.
So it's actually good business to treat people well, especially when the machinery they are operating costs $500,000. You don't want a sleep-deprived, angry worker operating a high-precision robot.
Exactly. You need engagement. You need skill. You need someone who cares if the robot is misaligned by a single millimeter, because that could ruin a whole batch of product.
And this brings us to the potential for a different kind of career path for these workers. There's a narrative I've been following about a technician's path that really highlights this shift in corporate responsibility. I read about a specialist named Zhang who works for one of the major telecom suppliers.
Huh.
For years, the culture was 996, and the assumption was that you just work until you burn out. But recently, under the dual pressure of government oversight and a new corporate social responsibility mandate, his company had to restructure its entire compensation logic.
Away from just hours.
Completely. Try to imagine a system where your value isn't determined by how many hours you sit at your desk, but by the complexity of the problems you solve.
A merit-based system.
A true one. I heard that Zhang's base salary was adjusted to reflect his technical certifications, finally allowing him to afford a modest apartment and, more importantly, the time to actually live in it.
That's the dream, isn't it?
It is. And some critics might argue this increases costs and makes manufacturing less competitive, but when I look at Zhang's story, I see the long game. By integrating government-mandated wage floors with corporate technical ladders, Shenzhen is building an ecosystem where the next generation doesn't just want to escape the factory, they want to lead it.
That's a powerful idea.
It's about creating generational upward mobility. To me, this story suggests that the true value of Made in China is finally starting to include the well-being of the people who make it.
Zhang represents the quality revolution that former Premier Li Keqiang has discussed. It connects to what Premier Partners calls the hidden champions ecosystem. This is a concept they've borrowed from the German economy, the middle stand.
The middle stand, what's that?
It refers to small and medium enterprises that are world leaders in a very specific global niche. They might make a specific screw for an airplane or a unique lens for a medical camera. They aren't famous brands, but they are absolutely essential to the global supply chain.
Okay, I see.
China is actively nurturing these little giants companies that are technologically advanced and highly specialized. And these companies need skilled technical labor, like Zhang. They don't need assembly line bodies, they need brains.
But getting from the assembly line to where Zhang is, that's a hard jump. That requires education, certification, time, and sometimes it requires intervention when things go wrong. The source material mentions a case from 2016 in Shenzhen where the district trade union actually intervened to help workers secure layoff compensation.
Yes, the China Labor Bulletin reported on that. It was the Longhua District Trade Union. And it was a really surprising intervention where the union helped workers negotiate directly with management to get a lump sum compensation package when a factory was relocating.
That's interesting because we usually assume trade unions in China are just rubber stamps for the government.
And they often are.
Yeah.
But here they were actively negotiating for the workers. It shows there is a precedent for the state or its affiliated union stepping in to manage the fallout of this industrial restructuring.
So it reinforces the idea that laws don't enforce themselves.
They don't. Someone has to step in. In that case, the union, acting as an arm of the state's stability maintenance, realized that if they didn't get these workers paid, they would have a riot on their hands. So they facilitated the payment. They were preventing the chaos that we saw at Yilishing by getting ahead of the problem.
It's fascinating to see how the union's role is evolving from just organizing strikes or more often preventing them to actually facilitating these difficult economic transitions.
It has to evolve. The economy is evolving.
Now, before we get too focused just on Shenzhen, we have to acknowledge that this isn't just a Chinese problem. The Rockbird media source points out that this tension between productivity and burnout is global.
Absolutely. Look at South Korea. They have a legal 52-hour work limit, but tech workers there are reporting mounting output pressure. The law says stop, but the deadlines say go. And there was that huge controversy recently about the government suggesting raising the cap to 69 hours a week.
Right. The backlash was intense. The younger generation effectively said, no, we are not going back to that.
Exactly. And then you look at Silicon Valley. We see hustle culture and the AI-driven productivity race mimicking the 996 structure.
Yeah.
Sleeping in the office, founder mode, all of that. We are all dealing with the same basic problem. Technology is moving faster than human biology.
It's the universal struggle of the modern economy. We have these amazing tools, AI, automation, that should be giving us more leisure time. Keynes predicted this back in the 1930s, that by now we'd all be working 15-hour weeks.
And yet here we are.
And instead, these tools seem to be intensifying the pressure. The email never stops. The Slack notifications never stop. The machine is always on.
It raises the fundamental question. Can productivity innovation coexist with human sustainability? Or does the machine always demand more from its human operator?
So, bringing it all back to the Yilishing dispute and this logic of survival, we have a source here from Jason B. that breaks down the responsibility into 3 neat layers. I think this is a really useful framework for our listeners to wrap their heads around this complex mess.
It is. The first layer is the company, and they cannot claim innocence. If their pay model requires overtime for survival, then compliance that leads to poverty is a strategy of harm. As the source says, a legal schedule is not justice if it produces a life that can't be lived.
That's a powerful line. A legal schedule is not justice if it produces a life that can't be lived.
You cannot pay a sub-survival wage and then hide behind the labor law manual. It's just not credible.
Then there's the second layer, the local state.
Right. Standards on paper are, as you said earlier, merely decorative without enforcement. Stability depends on rapid, credible remedy. When workers have a grievance, there has to be a system that works and works quickly.
And the state is the one that sets the floor.
They are. The state acts as the architect of the whole system. If the building collapses, if the social contract collapses because the minimum wage is too low, the architect has to answer for it. They set the floor too low relative to the cost of living.
And the third layer is the system itself, the incentives that manufacture this kind of legal poverty.
This is where the Jason B. source suggests concrete reforms for stability. First, make the minimum wage meaningful in lived terms. What is the actual take-home pay, not just the gross number?
What's left after all the deductions?
Exactly. Second, enforce compensation during these soft layoffs. You can't let companies use rule changes to dodge their severance obligations. And third, and I think this is the most important one, treat overtime dependence as a governance failure, not a cultural quirk.
Overtime dependence as a governance failure. That is a complete reversal of how we usually think about the hardworking ethos. We often romanticize the hustle, the grind.
We do.
But this suggests that if you have to work 70 hours a week just to eat and pay rent, the system has failed you. It's not a badge of honor. It's a symptom of a broken wage structure.
Precisely. A healthy economy, a healthy society should allow a person to survive and even thrive on a standard work week. That is the baseline of modern civilization.
We have covered a lot of ground today. I mean, we started with a strike against legal hours, which sounded completely crazy at first, and we ended up discussing the massive structural shift of a superpower economy.
We did. The core conflict is between the old model survival via exhaustion, the 996 grind, and the new model prosperity via technical skill and automation.
And the danger is in the transition. The old Chens and the Lilies of the world are caught in the gap. They are legally protected by the new hours, but financially ruined by the old wages.
They're standing on a bridge that is being built while the one behind them is on fire.
That is the crux of it. The transition period is where people get hurt.
It is.
It leaves us with a final thought to chew on. The true test of this Industrial Revolution Industry 4.0, made in China 2025, whatever you want to call it, it isn't the number of robots installed. It's not the GDP growth figures. It is whether the system can construct a reality where a normal work week is no longer a path to poverty. As the source material suggests, a society cannot claim long-term stability if the survival of its people depends on their desperation to be overworked.